Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to our session on design and health within architecture education, diverse teaching approaches and career pathways. So today our group of faculty, researchers, graduate students, and practitioners from the University of Michigan will discuss a sampling of teaching approaches and career pathways within design and health in architecture education. So each of us are going to introduce ourselves before our own talks, and I'll just give a brief overview of our session. So over the past 2 decades, we've seen an encouraging increase in built environment and health research and teaching in both planning and public health and in architecture and design, including and beyond a focus on healthcare. So there's been an increase in peer-reviewed articles, books, textbooks, professional organization efforts and certifications, and so on. We've also seen new and continuing degree and joint degree programs, research groups and institutes form, and a variety of courses offered across many institutions. So this is an informal and likely incomplete list of programs that offer degrees or programs, or even just a course focused on architecture and health in their curriculum here. And so there's quite a variety of programs. They're largely for graduate students, though, at least in our search. And so the variations in classes, departments, disciplines, and so on can make it a little bit complex for students interested in this area to navigate and find the right program, the right pathway for their career, and so on. So our session today will have 3 talks. The first, leveraging synergies between healthy living and sustainable design, will discuss a foundational introductory course for undergraduate students in architecture and other disciplines to get them excited about health and sustainability in the built environment. The second talk, we'll hear from 2 current graduate students at the University of Michigan who will discuss their experiences and backgrounds and pathways to finding their program and pursuing their interests. And then finally, our 2 faculty and practitioners from architecture and medicine will discuss non-traditional career pathways and bridging to practice in education. So each of the presentations will last about 20 minutes, and we'll have a 5-minute Q&A in between, and then hopefully a few minutes at the end for a bit of a panel discussion. So with that, I'll start the first talk. So good morning again. I'm Kim Rawlings. I'm a Health and Design Research Fellow at the University of Michigan, working with the Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation, and also Dr. Andrew Ibrahim, who you'll hear from in a bit this morning. And so I'm going to talk about this course that I had developed when I was on the faculty at the University of Notre Dame in the School of Architecture and Psychology. And so excuse me while I advance the slide. There we go. So since we're thinking about pathways, I'll just give a quick overview of my own background. I studied architecture as an undergraduate student at Notre Dame. I bounced around between high-end residential firms and taking some coursework to try to get into graduate school and find the right program. I eventually landed at Cornell University, where I did my master's and Ph.D. In what's now the Department of Human-Centered Design. I attended my first EDRA in 2010, and I was then on the faculty at Notre Dame in architecture and psychology, as I mentioned, 2 different departments, not a joint department. And then I joined the University of Michigan last year. And so I'm grateful to be able to talk about this class today. So my talk will focus on some considerations for students, the department, the university and community when developing this new course in a department that did not have an agenda focused on health or sustainability or courses in those areas. I'll give an overview of the course and some details about the structure, the content, and the assignments, and then go over some successes, challenges, and opportunities. Excuse me, this slide didn't advance here. Okay. So when thinking about how to develop this course, I had to take into account several different needs and considerations across campus. So thinking about students, I took an inventory from undergraduates especially. There was an increasing interest and a lot of programming around environmental sustainability, social justice, and community engagement were very popular and continue to be as well. There's also growing interest in human health, community health, and planetary health. And so just practically thinking about courses that would fit students' interests, and then very practically making sure the schedule would allow for students to take the course when it was offered, that it would fit department and university requirements, especially for architects and engineers who had very few spaces in their schedule for elective courses or taking courses that were in their interests outside of their department requirements. So things like double counting and figuring out how to make that work were important. For the department, the School of Architecture, the college, the increasing focus in the NAAB accreditation requirements are looking at sustainability, so that provided some rationale to add another course focused on health and sustainability. There was a gap in human-centered design in our curriculum, so there was an opportunity there. And there's a need for more attention to equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice in architecture more broadly. And we also had to think about enrollment. So we were a small department. Whenever we started an elective, it was often under-enrolled and the courses weren't sustainable. So we couldn't meet the minimum requirements for 5 students or whatever. So we had to think about how to set that up. So there was opportunities there, especially to offer a course that was open to students for cross disciplines. The university also really incentivizes and wants to offer undergraduate students courses in all colleges. And so the School of Architecture had very few options available to students on campus. So there was an opportunity there. There was an increase in project-based learning on campus, so doing hands-on activities, learning by doing. There was also this goal to create transformative or transformational learning experiences for undergrads. So these sort of landmark courses that students would really be attracted to and want to take, and that would inform the rest of their academic experience in their career. And then because community engagement was important on campus, there really were a lot of opportunities and partnerships on campus, but not a lot of built environment and health specifically. Not a lot of awareness yet. And there also wasn't a lot of engagement with architecture because fitting that with their demanding schedule was challenging. So the course that was developed was called Social Factors and Sustainability, Effects of the Built Environment on Health. It was an advanced but introductory level course for upper level undergraduate students. Eventually some early graduate students joined the class as well. The content drew largely from architecture, planning, public health, and environmental psychology. So some of the textbooks and books shown here, as well as a lot of peer-reviewed articles. There's a lecture seminar hybrid course. And so I did some lecturing, but then there was a lot of discussion and hands-on activities that I'll talk about. It became an open elective course option across campus. And so it was housed in the departments of architecture and psychology, cross-listed, and then we had minor programs or concentrations on campus. So there was a sustainability minor that the course counted towards, more recently a real estate minor in the College of Business. Poverty and energy studies also picked up the class. Science, technology, and values wanted their students introduced to social issues. The global health graduate program, and then again, community engagement was an important component. So there was really a demand for this course across campus for the topic. So students, the course had to accommodate students from many different disciplines. So the distribution varied each year, but this shows the enrollment over about the past 5 years. So there were a lot of students from architecture and psychology, as we would expect, given that it counted towards their majors. The real estate minor really brought a lot of business students. We had design and health professions, so global health, pre-med, and the design department also enrolled policy-related fields in peace studies, public service, political science, global affairs, international development, poverty studies, and so on. And then about another quarter from a variety of engineering and science disciplines, science, business, and then others who are just really interested in taking a course in the School of Architecture as one of their electives. So we had multidisciplinary students coming into the class to learn some interdisciplinary content. So the course frames health within the context of social sustainability, thinking of health and especially health equity as a component. So the 2 definitions and the 6 components that were used are here. Sustainability is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we were thinking of environmental, economic, and social, or people, planet, profit, if you've heard that, those concepts. And then health, the definition we've heard a lot this week from the World Health Organization, thinking a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And so students were asked to think about each topic we talked about in course within these 6 concepts. So it really conceptualized health and sustainability for them when most of them had been focused on just 1 or 2 of these 6 components. So they had to think about connections between all of these. So there were 4 learning objectives, describing influences of the built and natural environment on health and sustainability across multiple environmental scales. So we were thinking of a social ecological approach from interiors and spaces to buildings, neighborhoods, communities, and cities. Students were to recognize issues and projects related to course content, think critically to apply content to real world course contexts, and then be able to suggest solutions. So design guidelines were a popular format, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the assignments were as well. The course structure and outline was 5 sections. We started with history and theory, thinking about the evolution and overlap of public health and planning, architecture and health, redlining, segregation, structural racism, especially the last few years, and then theories and frameworks from the different disciplines that I mentioned. I also introduced them to some of the methods used in this field, observations, behavioral annotations, post-occupancy evaluation, health impact assessments, design guidelines, programming and patterns, and then peer-reviewed research. So they were introduced to each of these, and the level was to just get them to understand what method was used when, and then they dove more into observation and design guidelines. Then the majority of the content was in these 3 units: healthy people, healthy places, and healthy planet. We looked at physical health, mostly focused on diet and physical activity, mental health, social well-being, looking at vulnerable populations, health disparities and equity, accessibility and universal design, and nature and restorative environments. The Healthy Places unit really introduced us to the environmental psychology literature within the context of place types, so thinking about housing, schools, healthcare, workplaces, and so on. And then Healthy Planet ended up being a summary of a lot of the environmental sustainability concepts we talked about in the first 4 units, and then added some green building and health information and planning and community health at the city and larger environmental scales. I spent the first few years developing a lot of interactive activities to build towards this idea of this transformative learning experience. They started with a syllabus review, which was just a great exercise to improve communication between students and faculty, but also it was a good icebreaker. So students could read through the syllabus, understand exactly what they had signed up for, and talk to each other and get to know students from other disciplines. Many hadn't taken a class that was so interdisciplinary before. I also purchased some vision impairment simulation glasses. In parallel to our architecture's accessibility day, where they took wheelchairs and focused on mobility issues, students were given a set of tasks wearing these different visual impairment glasses to do there. They watched some videos and exercises. We did what was called a privilege for sale exercise that introduced especially science and architecture and design students to some of the social issues associated with health disparities. I used Gary Evans and Dan Stokel's, who are longtime EDRA members, personal space invasion exercise to introduce proxemics, or how we maintain space between each other and how that manifests in the built environment. Guest lectures and field trips. I started when then Mayor Pete Buttigieg was in South Bend. And so we were able to work with the mayor's office administration, the health department, and the Office of Sustainability on a lot of the community projects that students did. We did a walking school bus with the mayor's office and Richard Jackson, who's one of the editors of the Making Healthy Places textbook, and some other events to both motivate students and get interest and awareness up on campus and in the community. And final presentations turned into an event. They were poster style presentations where students could invite their classmates, their partners, other faculty. It was a great recruiting tool for future classes, and it really was a celebration of the work they had done all semester. So just a quick overview of the assignments and assessments. There were small assignments and a semester project. I'll give a couple examples. This was a really great way to level the playing field and get all students engaged in new topics, new materials, and so on. And then they were able to do a deeper dive in the semester project. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about these next. So the purpose of the small assignments was to motivate interest and engagement. These were hands-on interactive activities students would learn by doing. It introduced them to a variety of methods and helped develop their critical thinking skills. They were very small point allocations, so it removed the fear of failing. A lot of architecture students were afraid of the peer-reviewed articles. Non-architecture students had to draw things for assignments, and so they all were helping each other. And so it really facilitated a lot of interest and engagement among the students. The course content and real-world applications they were introduced to through these assignments helped them prep for the semester project and review exercise, and they got to know available resources and their classmates through a lot of these assignments. So just a couple quick examples. We watched William White's Social Life of Small Urban Spaces and read an excerpt from that. And then they did an observation on campus where they had to document and draw a plan of the space. We used Zeisel's behavioral annotations to then evaluate the space based on the components talked about by White. And then they thought about how public spaces on campus and beyond would connect to health and sustainability. They also used the behavioral annotations again to compare spaces on campus when we introduced the environmental psychology concepts. So they were looking at things like sensory stimulation, accessibility, comfort, crowding, privacy, and so on, that they had all studied and created research briefs for each other and taught each other those concepts. And then they went and evaluated pairs of spaces on campus, wellness, workplaces, classrooms, dining halls, et cetera. The purpose of the larger semester project was to bridge a research practice gap. And this was where students could really use their own experiences and interests and do a deep dive on a topic. So they got to select their own topic within the broad umbrella of built environment, health, and sustainability. This is a project-based learning approach. This also leveled the playing field. All the students were introduced to how to access library resources, how to read a peer-reviewed article, how to do a search, and so on. And then they were able to apply the knowledge from this to a real-world problem or partner. This was a great assignment because it allowed me to adapt to varying interests and fields and class sizes, and also adapt to different program needs. So a student from energy studies, for example, would have to focus on energy for that topic. A psychology student needed a class that had a writing component. So we could easily adapt these projects to meet the requirements for their own discipline. So the semester project had 3 parts. They first created a proposal where they identified their topic, the final deliverable, and a community partner. It became optional because the class size got too large. They then did an annotated bibliography. So we went to the library. They learned how to find actual books and articles and different resources. So peer-reviewed articles for architecture and design students who hadn't done that before, history and humanities for more social science and science students who were used to the peer-reviewed articles. And then they had to identify sources that looked at the history of their topic, connections to health and sustainability, user groups, environmental psychology, guidelines and policies, and successful examples. And then they created a final written document or deliverable. They chose a lit review, a report, which is a more targeted lit review with their community partner or design guidelines. This allowed them to apply what they had researched to suggest solutions to a real world problem. And it worked on their written, verbal, and presentation skills. So if they were working with architects or designers, how do you take that research and synthesize it for that audience? Or if you're working for a community partner, and so on. So these are just some examples of the project topics that they selected. The 2 orange images at the bottom are a set of design guidelines that looked at healthy and sustainable tiny house living. This architecture student was really interested in looking at the implications of things like crowding and other ideas. And so there was a really broad variety of topics that students could select. They were given some suggestions, but others came with interest as well. So there were benefits and challenges to this approach. The small assignments were great for introducing a lot of topics in a broad way. They reduced the fear of error and improved interest and engagement. It scaled to larger class sizes, but we were really limited by the length of the class period because we did the interactive exercise in one class period, and we didn't take a deep dive into those topics, and larger classes had to be divided into smaller groups. In terms of the semester project, students could select their own topic, which really attracted a lot, and they could explore it in depth. It was a very flexible framework, and the project and community-based approach was attractive. At the same time, it intimidated some students. So seeing a big semester written project discouraged enrollment for some. Based on feedback, it's a time commitment for the instructor in terms of grading, face time, community partner engagement, and then it just doesn't scale up. So a class of 20 was quite a bit, but when it got towards 30, we partnered projects because it was just a bit much when everyone had their own partner and own topic. And thinking about the successes, again, at these different levels of the university, students did report quite an increase in interest and awareness in built environment, health, and sustainability. It increased engagement in the class and beyond, in their other classes and studios and so on. Students gave a lot of great feedback and helped develop the course each semester and over time. They also became advocates for the topic on campus, in their own departments, and in their activities in the community. For faculty in the School of Architecture, it really helped me build synergy between my teaching and research. There were spin-off projects I could use in my research. I could recruit research assistants from the class. It was a model for course development in architecture, just in terms of thinking about how do we set up electives, maybe start a new concentration or area and get interest. We were able to have sustainable enrollment over time. And then we did attract diverse fields and perspectives at quite a higher percentage in this class than other architecture classes. At the university level, it was a successful elective option for students from all colleges. There were new projects and partnerships formed from this class and beyond. And we also were able to think about impact. So we weren't only just teaching architecture and design students, but we were teaching other stakeholders. So business students who were going to go and hire an architect for their firm and so on. So we were really able to talk about built environment, health, and sustainability across disciplines. And then at the community level, there was a significant increase in awareness of built environment, health, and sustainability. There increased engagement with architecture as well. And then there was a lot of campus and community networks that formed. So there were a lot of projects and initiatives in the city and so on that brought in architecture students from this class or faculty who had worked with this class to think about how the built environment, health, and sustainability related to whatever was going on. So that was really great to see. There were some challenges and limitations of the course approach. So the variability in students and class size did affect some semester project quality, especially with community partners. So we did have a few duds that needed to be addressed with partners and students. This was an elective class, so I took advantage of the self-selecting population that was very excited to be there. I think things would change if it was a required course and not every student necessarily bought into needing to learn how to do research or read this type of literature. So that would have to be considered. And then with the addition of graduate students, it fit for some, but the approach was definitely geared towards undergrad. So I think in the future, I would definitely recommend a separate class or that grad students audited the lectures and then did a separate seminar section with me. It was always a struggle to balance breadth versus depth. I covered quite a few topics at very high levels. So it really limited in-depth exploration to that semester project. And then there was also limited studio application. So the architecture students could take the course content and apply it to their projects, but other students weren't really exposed to actually how to design. They could talk about it, they could evaluate it, they could research it, but they weren't actually introduced to design. There was also a lack of continuity. I really wanted the course to be a prerequisite for my studio or another studio, and we weren't able to fit that in the curriculum. So it was up to individual architecture students to pursue their interests in this area in other classes or in their thesis projects, which many of them did. And then in terms of community engagement, it's a big time commitment for the instructor and the students, also the partners. And there's risk associated with doing community engagement, especially with undergraduate students. And the course really depended on developing this awareness of built environment, health, and sustainability that just wasn't there when I started. So it took a few years before we could really get people on board and just get it set up to have projects and partners each year available. So then just to think of the future and opportunities and next steps, it would be great to develop additional courses, think about that continuity. There's an opportunity for co-teaching given the interdisciplinary course content that could also help sustain a course like this, and then hopefully inform some more curricular requirements, if not electives, and formal program development. Again, we were in a department with no agenda or formal programming around health and sustainability. And in the future, I think it was mentioned at a session yesterday that being able to connect instructors who are teaching these courses and starting these courses in architecture departments would be really helpful. Having a repository for resources and syllabi. I think planning and public health did that once. At Georgia Tech, there used to be a website where you could go and pull a bunch of syllabi. It would be great for architecture and health faculty as well to have that. And then informing future NAAB accreditation requirements, especially related to sustainability, to leverage the overlap between sustainability and health would be really great. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks so much, Kim. That was very impressive. We teach some of these things at Clemson, and it's almost like we split it into 4 courses. You have it all in one. So that's pretty impressive. And there's a lot of content that you cover. You mentioned the breadth versus depth aspect of it. Does it make sense to kind of maybe focus on one aspect and go deeper? Is that a lesson learned? Or I really love the fact that they do the observations, they read about William White, and then they actually put the research methods into practice, because we struggle with that. How do you get Masters of Architecture students to get excited about research methods, and how do they see it being applied in their future careers? It's a required course for our students, so they do it, but they're not all excited. So it's just a question. And the other thing I was going to say is there's a couple of programs that are doing similar things, which are multidisciplinary. I know Craig and Armenia have been doing stuff at Georgia Tech where they have a design project at the end and they have a focused area. So they do all of that, and then the design could be a small piece of it. and personally is something I wanted to do for a while, I haven't found the time, is to do something like that, that eventually is multidisciplinary. You can have industrial engineering people and other disciplines. Any lessons learned that you would take from moving from the this is what it's about to the design all in one class?
Yeah, I really wanted to set up a joint class where we'd have the elective and then partner with the studio. So maybe, you know, the design guidelines that were generated from the class could become small assignments that inform design. I think ideally if we had a more architecture design focused class, we could introduce design, but because this is literally the only class on campus that covers these topics. And so at first I did start to do deeper dives and it just didn't stick with students. And so this broad survey, the goal ended up being just getting students excited and interested about it. And they ended up recruiting other students and getting more architecture students involved and engaged in it because you can imagine the discussions about what research is or what my work looked like or what I was introducing them to and how to fit into studio. And then once I had my studio set up and established, the students who had taken that course were able to inform students in the studio. They would consult each other. So there was this informal connection, but I think in terms of making the formal connection, the semester project was one of those pathways to do that. So the architecture students could do something related to their studio project or their thesis as like a preparatory course. But otherwise, I think we definitely need more courses to do exactly what you said.
Because it's hard to get it all in one.
Yeah, it's really a broad overview survey intro course just to introduce the topics, and then students go off and try to find ways to pursue it in other classes.
And I think this would be a great thing for undergraduate students in architecture, like at Clemson, because they don't get to know about any of this stuff until they get into a master's program. Yeah. But this could get them excited about it, I think. Thank you for laying it out. I'd love to see your curriculum sometime.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? Okay, with that, I'll introduce our next two speakers. Hannah Myers and Maya Fraser will talk about their perspectives and pathways as graduate students.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. So we're here to bring the student perspective to this whole curriculum discussion that we've been having. So our talk is the pursuing academic and career interests in design and health, student perspectives. Quick introductions.
My name is Maya Fraser, and I'm a current MArch student at Taubman College at the University of Michigan.
And I'm Hannah Myers. I'm an architect, and I'm a current PhD student in design science at the University of Michigan. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna talk about my path, which is basically from going from design in architecture into health. And then Maya's gonna talk about her path, which is going from public health into design. We'll kind of tease out some common themes that we've noticed in both of our pathways. We'll finish up with a little bit of advice, and then we'd love to take your questions. Okay, so here's my academic and professional background. As you can see, it's basically architecture, 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 some more architecture, a little bit of urban planning. And then I decided to go back to graduate school after practicing at a firm in DC for 8 years. So now I'm studying health in the built environment in my design science program there. Okay, so how did I get into this field? My formation of interests really began in undergrad. One of my studio professors screened the documentary, William White's The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, and I got really excited about learning how to build space that would be useful for humans, that humans would like to use and live in and socialize in. And it's one of the reasons why I got into the CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism. And it's also one of the reasons why when I went to pursue my graduate education, I chose Notre Dame because they had a strong traditional urbanism program. But when I got to Notre Dame, rather than getting more of that really interesting research-based empirical understanding of what makes the built environment good for humans, I was exposed to a lot of anecdotal work by architectural theorists and moral philosophers, which provided a really interesting background for the motivation for studying this topic, but I really wanted that heavier research focus. And I really wish Kim had been at Notre Dame when I was there, because I would have taken that class and I would have loved it. oh, I should actually, so while in industry, I also began thinking about how the people that I was doing work for, I worked in single family high-end residential. So we built really beautiful, beautiful projects, but we only built them for the select few people, a very privileged group. And, it always weighed on my mind that we're doing this great design work for people that can afford it, but I believe that everyone should be able to take advantage of good design. I don't think good design should be a privilege. I think it should be a right. So leaning into that value, I began pursuing figuring out how to go back to school to get my career better in line with my personal values. Okay, so I couldn't do it alone. So I wanted to introduce you to some of the important people that got me on this path. These four people, Dr. Chris Miller, Professor John Barry, Professor Philip Bess, and Professor Douglas Dewani, they probably don't know how much they planted the seed of this interest in my mind when I was in undergrad and graduate school in their classes. But they introduced me to things like the William White documentary and really foundational books like Pattern Language, The Geography of Nowhere, Image of the City, and The Architecture of Conviviality. And it's those early influences that really began to germinate and grow as I continued my architecture career, and they've never really went away. So I found my next connection by being pretty vulnerable and honest with myself and with my friends. I was shy about my interests because it's not something that's really talked about in architecture school. I think most architects go to school to become architects, and they want to build things. And I have this weird idea of bringing psychology into the built environment. So I told a friend at a bar what I was interested in, and it was not his thing at all. However, he just happened to have been a teaching assistant in Kim's class at Notre Dame, and so he gave me her name. And from there, I basically cold emailed her. She had no idea who I was, but I said, "Hi, I want to do what you do. Can you help me?" And she said yes, which is great. I don't think I'd be here today if it wasn't for her support. So with her help, I began to find programs, relevant programs. I applied to programs. I was rejected from many programs because it's a lot to figure out as a professional jumping back into academia. One of those programs that I applied to and was rejected from was Michigan's Health and Design Fellowship. And that's how I met Andrew. And kind of at the same time, though, it's not all bad news. Even though I was rejected from that program, at the same time, I had also applied to a master's program at the University of Michigan in Design Science. So Dr. Matt Reed, the chair of that program at the time, called me up. And after introductions, he said, "Hey, so why are you getting another master's degree? You already have two." And I said, "I don't know how to research. I need somebody to help me. I figured I better do that first, then go into a PhD program." It's some feedback that I had gotten in the past from my rejections. And he said, "Well, why don't we just give you a PhD? Why don't you just come here, do the PhD?" And I said, "Okay." So from then it moved very quickly. He connected me with Dr. Linda Grote, who became one of my advisors. Andrew became another advisor, and my network began to grow from there. And now, Maya and I are up here doing this talk together, and I've met a lot of people here. So that network just continues to grow, and it's really exciting to see happen. Next, let's see if it can. There we go. Okay, so there are a lot of challenges with this path. So for one thing, I didn't know any of the vocabulary when I started researching these issues. I didn't know what environment behavior was. I was basically Googling environmental psychology programs, which, I mean, that's a really broad thing. Is it environmental sustainability? Is it how people feel about the environment and how they behave sustainably or not? Is it the built environment? So it helped to find the APA Division 34 website. They provide a list of graduate programs that are related more to the topics that I was interested in pursuing. Once I found some programs, it became really key to find individuals within those programs who could support the research that I wanted to do. And the way I kind of figured that out was I found some papers that I really liked from these key faculty members. And then from there, I searched for who they collaborated with on other papers. And I just kind of created a web of people that I was interested in working with. And all of this was organized in spreadsheets that I still rely on today. It's a pretty good resource. I considered other programs besides Michigan, including Wisconsin's Design Studies program and Cornell's Human Environment Relations program. But I chose Michigan for a combination of personal and professional and practical reasons. Financial reasons were definitely a big part. A PhD is definitely more affordable than another master's. And my personal network is nearby, and I had already made these great connections at Michigan, so it made the decision much easier. However, even though it was the right choice for me, there still are challenges within my program. I'm the first person in my program to study the built environment. So I'm kind of having to build I keep calling it a DIY PhD. I have to figure out what I need and I got to go find it. And I just kind of cobble it together. But as you can see from this image, it's hard to reach across disciplines and put a schedule together, because oftentimes the classes I'm interested in taking are electives and they just conflict. So it's been kind of like putting together a puzzle. For future career goals, I won't spend much time because honestly, I'm not sure yet, but I like the idea of teaching. There's a clear gap in how architects are trained right now. They don't think about these topics. We're not taught these topics. And I think it's a gap that needs to be filled. Research is still something that I'm getting my feet wet in, but I really enjoy it. So I don't want to close the door on that either. And then part of my program is a public policy certificate in science, technology, and public policy. So that could be a really great way to learn how to insert the research that I will be doing in a meaningful way that could really change the way we currently build. So anyway, with that, I'm going to let Maya talk.
Hey everyone, thanks Hannah for walking us through your path. My path is basically the opposite of Hannah's. I started out in public health and now I'm seeking to add a design component to that. But I actually started out in sociology originally as an undergrad before moving to Seattle to work at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation as a mortality researcher. So this was very quantitative, a lot of coding. I'm kind of in that sphere of things. And while I was there, I was able to do my master's in public health at the University of Washington. After I finished that, I went to PATH, which is a global health organization, and I worked on a malaria project doing impact evaluation and also a lot of other survey work. And currently I am an MArch student at the University of Michigan and also do research assistant work with a group of design and health professors there. So even though I'm now kind of adding this design component, I think for me, the interest in design and health really stretches back to my undergrad. When I was doing my sociology major, I took an urban health class, and there we read Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, which I think was the first time I'd ever seen the social outcomes really linked to what the built environment was like and health outcomes and how all of these things are influencing people's lives. When I was in graduate school, I took Andrew Dannenberg's Health in the Built Environment course. And there we looked at the textbook, Making Healthy Places, with which Andrew is one of the one of the authors of. And I think the class really opened my eyes to sort of how many ways the built environment influences health. And that was the moment that I said, okay, yeah, this is what I want to do. But I didn't know how to do it. When I graduated, I looked at jobs in the field and I wasn't really finding anything that seemed like it matched my skills, or there were things that required skills I didn't have. So I said, okay, I'm just going to get a job that I can get in global health. And that's how I came to PATH, which was a really valuable experience. And I think reinforced for me how many different ways the built environment impacts people's health. So I was working on malaria, which I think of as a disease of poverty and the way that poverty manifests itself through the built environment. So that's how people live and how they're exposed to mosquitoes, and also how far away they find themselves from health facilities that can treat them if they get malaria. And then finally, like, I think a lot of people here, this was influenced by a personal experience that I had, which was watching my grandmother age in place in New York City, and the ways that the city both helped and hindered her in her life. So it helped her in terms of being around lots of neighbors and being within walking distance of shops, which is not true of people living in, you know, suburban and rural areas, but also the city itself was difficult to navigate. She lived on a really steep street that meant in the winter, it was pretty unnavigable. When I decided that I wanted to pursue design and health and really make a go for it after I'd been at Path for a couple of years, I reached back out to Andrew Dannenberg, who was incredibly helpful and started putting me in contact with former students, most of which were at, I'd say, transit-related firms in the Seattle area. So through talking to them and then talking to some of their colleagues, I was able to look at people's different backgrounds. So I talked to landscape architectures, people at urban planning degrees, and people at architecture degrees. And I started to think, well, architecture has always been really interesting to me. Is that a possibility for me? And at this time, I started talking with the career coach as well. And I think she really gave me the confidence to say, no, I can take on this new thing that seems pretty scary and make it work for me. To test out whether architecture would actually be a good fit, I did the Intro to Architecture program at Columbia University. And there I had Muniz Aksoy as my TA. And I think she's not involved in design and health, but she really helped me, helped to demystify architecture school, the profession of architecture, how you go about applying and making a portfolio, all of which were things, it was just a totally different world to me. So I think without her, I wouldn't have really been able to make that transition. But the big connection for design and health came for me now through meeting Andrew Ibrahim. I'm starting to notice a bit of a theme here. And he was actually introduced to me when I was thinking of going to Michigan. I had applied, but I hadn't chosen where I was going to go. And I was talking to Andrew Dannenberg, and he said, hey, you know, I know somebody in Michigan. Why don't I put you in touch? And so after talking to Andrew, I knew that there were people in Michigan who were interested in the same things that I was, and that I was really going to be able to make it work for me. And working with Andrew has led me to work with this whole group of professors, including Upali, who you're going to hear from in a minute as well, who all work on design and health, but from very different perspectives. And I've been able to become a research assistant with them, and we're looking at ways to bring design and health as a more prominent concentration at Michigan. And then finally, Andrew also introduced me to Kim and to Hannah, which is very exciting. I think one thing that EDRA is showing me, that my time in grad school is showing me, is that peer connections are incredibly important. So I know that we'll continue to be resources for each other as we move forward in our careers. I also have encountered some challenges. I think the biggest was just entering this world, not knowing kind of what degree I needed to do, what work I was interested in. So doing informational interviews was really helpful with that. But I think looking back, I still didn't really know what the whole world of possibility was. So for example, I didn't know that programs like Hannah's existed. I didn't know about product design or industrial design or any of these other things that become really relevant for health. So I think that that was a challenge, even though I'm quite happy where I ended up. The second issue was that it was very hard to figure out what school would be a good fit for MArch programs. There's a lot of rhetoric on websites, you know, we believe in these things, but then when you actually start to talk to students, it doesn't always match up. And so I found that that was actually, the best way to figure it out was to speak with people. So for example, at one school, somebody said, you know, if you're interested in the social impact of architecture, you do not want to come here. So that was a bit of a rude awakening. And then I think I sort of, in terms of curriculum, I have almost the opposite problem that Hannah does, where the MArch curriculum is very rigid. You know, you have to fulfill all of these degree requirements, and Michigan doesn't have a concentration in design and health. So I've sort of been trying to pull that together myself through the classes that and the electives I choose, the professors that I take studios with, my extracurricular activities and jobs, to try to bring that myself to the degree. And then finally, the career path forward is pretty unclear, but ultimately I see this as an opportunity, not as a problem. I don't think I'll ever be able to take off my researcher hat. It's, you know, it's glued there. That's what all of my previous work was in. But I'm finding that I also really, really enjoy design. And so my kind of question is, what job really meets at the intersection there? And I've seen a couple examples of, you know, fellowship programs at architecture firms that integrate research. And there are also other firms that I think where research is really important to their mission. So I'm actually interning at Mass Design Studio this summer. And then other studios that really appeal to me are some non-architecture studios. So there's Boncu's Health Design Lab at Thomas Jefferson and the Greater Good Studio in Chicago, where like research is a really central part of what they do.
Okay, so really brief to recap my path: architecture, architecture, architecture and urban design, architecture, and now design science, studying the built environment and health.
And so for me, started in sociology, I'm Ph.D. in health metrics, working in global health, and now an MArch student.
So I think that some of the key takeaways from our talk and some of the things that we found common, even though our paths are so different, there were common themes that we both experienced. And the first one is that informal networks are really key. And that might seem intimidating. I'm an introverted person, so meeting a lot of people sometimes overwhelms me, but truly you just need one good connection to start building that network. And that connection can really open a lot of doors for you. So start small and you'll get where you're going eventually.
And the second takeaway is that there's no right path. We have very different paths. Talking to people here, there have been so many different paths and degrees, but I think we each bring something different from our past with us, and that in this like interdisciplinary field is really a strength. So however you're getting there, it's okay.
And then finally, just a critique, I guess we both have, that we've come up against a lot of obstacles. And part of that is there's just no clear path. For Maya, she's got a really rigid curriculum that she's got to fit within for, her accreditation and making sure that she has a professional degree that can get her an architecture license at the end of this. So there's not a lot of room for electives. And for me, I have all of the room for electives. And sometimes that is also limiting, because how do I know where to spend my time? Where am I going to be able to, find the right things? And so that's a challenge that we both have encountered, but just from different ends of the spectrum.
So we'd like to offer one piece of advice to different audiences. So the first is to students, and to kind of reiterate what Hannah said earlier, talk to people. It's really the most important thing. So many people out there want to help. And I think something we both seen is that you just need one really good connection that can kind of open up a whole network of people to you. So for me, that was Andrew. And just don't get discouraged if you don't hear back from people. People's inboxes are full, and you just got to keep at it, and eventually it'll pan out.
For educators, I think representation is really important. Understanding what the possibilities are in this field is something that is kind of hard to visualize when you're just a young student starting out. You don't know what is out there, what is possible. So as you can, bring people in who are doing work in this field to serve as examples and help connect students to people that are doing work, different kinds of jobs in this field.
And then for administrators, and maybe also for faculty members, if this is possible, is to just create a map of design of courses that could kind of be pulled into an informal design concentration. So like if you are a student and you're interested, where do you even start in trying to pull this together yourself? Oh, okay. Last slide. So yeah, so thank you very much for listening to our presentation. And what questions do you have for us? Yeah, there's
such a big room.
Hi, my name is Ed Steinfeld. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Buffalo, but I'm also the second graduate of the doctoral program in architecture at Michigan.
Oh, wow. Go blue.
and I'm curious because as an alumnus, I'm curious about whether the faculty that are there now have conveyed to you the history of work in the field of environment and behavior that emerged in the late 60s and had a long history, and certainly many people from the school were involved in EDRA, including several graduate students who came with our professor, Leon Passelan, here to the EDRA conference, the second EDRA conference. And I'm just curious, do you know anything about that? Is there any like archive or way of connecting with that history?
Not that I know of, but I'd love to talk with you about it later, possibly.
Sure. I'd be happy to do that, except I have a presentation at the end of the session.
Okay.
But during the break, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah.
I can speak a little bit to that as well. Some of the people that I found early on, I was so excited to meet, and then I found that they were emeritus faculty. So Jean Weinman was one person I was really excited to get to know. And she was one of those people I mentioned when I was in Google Scholar figuring out, okay, who has collaborated with her, because she can't advise me anymore. Professor Ray DeYoung in the School for Environment and Sustainability actually taught the first environment behavior class I was able to take as a PhD student. And he still is teaching a lot of the work of Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. So I'm kind of getting that. I can see where that legacy is at Michigan still, but it is, yeah, it's hard to find. You have to kind of really be intentional and seek it out yourself. But it's still there. And I love the idea of creating an archive, because that would be such a great resource for people that come after us. So thank you for your question. Oh, right behind you.
Follow up on that. What's your advice for EDRA in terms of what EDRA could do what could have done to make your path easier and more direct, or could do now and in the future for other students coming along?
I think that's such a great question. I didn't know EDRA existed for a really long time until I started finding faculty who were doing research in the area that I wanted to do. And I kept seeing EDRA pop up and I'm like, well, what is that? So I Googled it, I found it, got super excited to join it. So maybe visibility, and I don't know, I'm not a marketing person, but I wish that maybe it had more presence in the programs that I was in coming up. So, I went to Judson University and Notre Dame. It would be great if there was more contact with schools, design schools in that way. And then also the way APA Division 34 has a list of graduate programs that are related to environment psychology issues. It would be awesome if EDRA would publish a list. I don't know if they have actually now, because I haven't seen all of the website, but I haven't seen one. But it would be amazing if there was a comprehensive list on EDRA's website saying, hey, here are the programs that might be helpful to you if you want to continue studying this. Okay, yeah.
I think for me, and this may be sort of a broader critique of the way that we silo work, but I don't think, when I was doing lots of Googling about design and health, I didn't know to Google, stuff about the environment. And so I think that, and EDRA is so well tailored to things I'm interested in, but when I was looking specifically for design and health, that didn't come up. So maybe it's something about how, the words that we're using to talk about these fields, and kind of making it more inclusive and, I guess, cross-disciplinary perhaps. So that would be my take.
Hopefully bring up the next.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much for your questions and comments.
Right. So how many people are studying how conference rooms should be designed? There are a lot of environment and behavior challenges with how we design conference rooms, but I'm also just fascinated by why everybody is on that side. Is it proximity to food, or is it proximity to the exit? Okay, or both. And I want to follow up on two of the comments that were made around environment and behavior before we get in. I had also applied to Michigan as a grad student because of the environment and behavior concentration. And over time, from a lot of the architecture programs, that has gone away. And a lot of architecture programs are high theory, high technology schools. And a lot of environment behavior programs are not in mainstream architecture courses. So I think that is something that AIA and EDRA at some point should talk about. All right, so our presentation today towards data-driven design for real-world architecture practice, the highlight really is on the real world to a large extent. Those of you who don't know Andrew after the two presentations we just went through will know him when he gives the keynote later today. But both of us have very non-traditional career pathways and are examples, I guess, of how that lands up. So Andrew, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I My first love was architecture. So if you saw my homework in the 3rd grade, I finished it as fast as I could, turned the paper over, and then started drawing cities and figured out what should be the appropriate ratio and density of commercial, residential, and industrial. I was that 7-year-old. And I think my parents didn't know what to do with me. So I ended up in med school at some point. And at some point you pick your head up and realize you have a lot of interests that you want to put together. So you'll hear more at noon, but I'm a practicing surgeon. I'm a formally trained health services researcher in econometrics. And I'm a senior principal at a global design firm in architecture, and have been able to put all 3 together. And hopefully you'll see in a few minutes how that plays out in an education format.
And I am the Global Director of Research for HKS, which is a large architecture firm with 2 of my research teammates in the audience today. I also teach part-time at Michigan with Andrew, which is a lot of fun. And I'm a fellow of the Institute for Health Policy Innovation, which is nothing that I would have ever thought about if we hadn't had these conversations. So very, very divergent paths. Mine is similar to Hannah, architecture, 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 except that in the PhD program, the DIY approach I took was a lot of environment and behavior, neuroscience, psychology. What I'm going to talk about for the first half of this presentation before giving it to Andrew is how a practitioner, because I'm very much anchored in the practice of architecture, in the day-to-day of integrating research in the practice of architecture. I teach this one tiny elective course that Maya and Zoe have both taken, and you didn't make your shameless plug, so I'll do it for you. What time are you presenting? 4. So there's a presentation at 4 o'clock that you guys should see that 2 students from the course are doing. Sorry? In the what? Okay, I totally heard just dog. In the Dogwood conference room. But the course is designed in a way that it bridges research and practice, and it asks this very simple question: how do we set the stage for better health by design? Because in a way, what you do with designing environments and designing architecture is set the stage. It's a very, very simple prompt. It's founded on the belief that design can make a difference. It's about linking design intent to health outcomes to improve health and well-being. It starts asking the question about what are measures? Are they meaningful? Do they matter? And can we as a community link design intent to outcomes? One of the things we talked about is both evidence-based design and evidence-challenging design. To really engage with evidence, you need to know how to challenge it. Only the person who questions the evidence is actually engaging with the evidence. So a lot of that is the premise of this course, which is a 409 and 509. So we get undergraduate and graduate students. And every year that I've taught it, which is 2.5 years now, it's been architecture, social work, health informatics, landscape. So it's interesting how people gravitate in different ways. But the key objective is to build a research-based design community. So every person on that course, if you guys see the website or at some slide, it might be. And if it's not, I'll give it to you later. Somewhere there's a website. But the objective is that there are intellectual traces that each student leaves behind. As someone in practice, I can't tell you how frustrating it is that amazing work happens in academia, that's somebody working on that exact problem somewhere else in the world is not tapping into. So for all the types of sustainability we talked about, we should also talk about intellectual sustainability. And the fact that someone has thought about something, I can actually have room to think about something different. So part of this is have every student put all of their work on an open source media in very, very simple terms. Everyone creates a LinkedIn profile. Everyone creates a Twitter account, in some part due to Andrew too. And everybody decides how do they go deep, but transfer that knowledge in a way that is very actionable to someone who doesn't know anything about what you're doing. We've done 4 different projects through the different semesters. We always talk about point of decision design, how we make decisions through design. We've taken on mental health, safety in the COVID semester, and then brain health. And for all of it, the prompt is again, how do you achieve this health outcome by design? That is why the course is Health by Design. At the end of the semester, you learn kind of 2 theoretical frameworks. One, the idea of a design continuum, to think about where you are in the design continuum instead of seeing architecture as a silo, all the way from information to the design of place to policy. The ability to link design to outcomes, and to take all of that at the end of the semester and put it in a 5-minute video, which is not always easy, but that is all they can do. It has to all be condensed in 5 minutes at the end of it. So if you really want to know what the course is like, talk to those 2. But it's been a very interesting experiment for me. Coming from practice, I've realized that the one thing that we don't have time for is to do work that cannot have an impact. That's just the one thing, saying that this is really, really important. How quickly do we translate it to something that can make a difference? How do you maintain rigor? At the same time, make sure that you actually are applicable. And that is where partnerships come in. A key component, and you'll hear about occupancy outcomes and evaluations from Andrew as well. We are terrible about measuring what we do, because what we do is very complex and it's really difficult, but also because we don't know how to measure. There are 2 components of that. But there's another component too, which is how do we actually articulate our design intent? Every design is a hypothesis. Every design wants to achieve something. How do you know it? Where do you document it? How will you measure it if you don't know what the intent was? So measuring outcomes after occupancy can become post-rationalization if your intent wasn't documented. So we spend a lot of time saying, what is your intent? Have you documented it? And go from there. This slide is absolutely impossible to read. And if you're doing the tennis match between my face and the screen, then even more so. But what it shows you is in a very simple way, what is the abstract? Where are you on the continuum? How do you go from a strategy to very specific outcomes that you want to measure? And then they do design, they do very quick designs, but their designs have to be both now, near, and far. So they have to have at least one solution that's implementable today, something that can be done in the next 3 to 5 years, and something that is really far reaching. And that's again, a way of scaling your thinking. And in conclusion for this course, it's been really simple. You make it real and you keep it simple. So the framework we use, Maya talked about vocabulary. I feel like if I had to put a resume together now, the #1 thing would be linguist. Because every discipline decides to use completely different words. And you're like, I think we are saying the same thing, but we're saying it in a different way. Right? So really work on that. We keep a very simple why, how, what, so what framework, ability to link design to outcomes, to scale across the continuum, to use and leverage primary and secondary research, to be applicable today. And then finally, to communicate simply, clearly, and actionably. Those are the requirements of this course, which are very simple. It's an elective, similar to Kim's course. It's a very survey level course, and hopefully people get interested. But our best case study is who you're going to talk about or hear about next from Andrew. So I think we will pass on and then do the Q&A together at the end of the session.
Thank you. So there's going to be a lesson here that if Upali asks you to speak in her class, you should definitely do it. And you'll see why in a minute. So I think as someone who's in practice, I share similar frustration that there's so much content expertise in academia that never makes its way into a design studio of work that's actually being implemented. I think this is generous to say that less than 5% of firms routinely do POEs. It's probably less than 2%, if we're being honest, despite how much money we spend in design. And so you can imagine music to my ears when a student from Upali's class came up to me after my talk and said, I want to measure the quality of design in hospitals. I was like, no way. This like prompted. I was like, this is great. So I will tell you a little bit about how I thought to approach that. How do you take someone who's very interested in design, is in a design class, and start to bring them into the world of data analytics to start to rigorously evaluate the space? And I'll explain all 3 of these at the end. He had to start where, so his name was Mitch, and he had to start where we all should start. What's been written? What are the things that influence the design of hospitals? And these were some of the key themes he pulled out in his systematic review. And then we went on a little journey. We got the floor plans of our hospital at Michigan, and we started going on a little bit of a walk. And he started to code all the design features of each room to understand all these things he was seeing in research. What do they actually manifest and look like in real life? And at one point, we're walking down this basement hallway, and he said, "Why on earth did you take me to a basement hallway?" And I said, "Well, Mitch, it turns out just through that door behind me are patient rooms." He's like, "You're kidding?" I said, "Yep, there is a 12 patient ward with no windows in the basement of the hospital, and we take care of patients there. And that's where I have to round." To make Mitch even more confused, we subsequently went to the 12th floor of our brand new building, which also took care of patients and had these views over our arboretum. And he's like, "Why aren't we spending more time in these rooms?" It just so happens to turn out what he was actually exposing was a really novel natural experiment. We're a high volume thyroid surgery center. We do well over a few hundred cases a year. And half of those patients go to that basement ward with no windows. And half of them go to these private rooms up on the 12th floor. And it's just randomly allocated based on where space is available. So it kind of created this interesting question, like, could we actually evaluate the differences in this novel natural experiment? So we hypothesized that of all the things we could measure in our EMR, what could we measure that could be different? So in our health system, we have clinical data on 4 million patients that we can readily access in the EMR. And after a little bit of a coding learning curve, you can get very proficient in extracting that data. And so what Mitch decided to look at was pain medication after surgery. There are certainly a number of landmark papers in our field that a room with a view will can potentially reduce the amount of pain medicine you need for a number of reasons and mechanisms. So Mitch went through the EMR, figured out how to code in that data, and I taught him some of our tried and true tricks there, took all the pain medications, converted them to a standardized morphine mill equivalents, and then compared them across these rooms. The punchline's a little different than where you think it's going. When you just look at the data initially unadjusted, the patients in private rooms with a view used more pain medicine, more narcotic pain medicine. So counterintuitive to what we know from so much of our literature, and kind of like a little bit of a mind twist. You know, it's like, did you code the data backwards? Was your 1 a 0 or your 0 a 1? And I was like, cool, that's a great, if you're teaching anyone data analytics, learning how to troubleshoot your data, incredibly powerful. And so we started to ask, you know, like, is this comparison fair? And are there things about the patients that go to one place or another that we're not accounting for? Which was the perfect segue to teach clinical risk adjustment, which we could do an entire day on if you want to, but then I probably wouldn't be invited back. But that is to say that what if some of these patients were on pain medications before surgery? What if they have other conditions that they're taking pain medicine for? And you could start to imagine that would very much skew these results. So we work through some clinical risk adjustment models, kind of using our tried and true things in the hospital. It turns out just risk adjusting for gender makes it even. That's a pretty big swing. Just 32 minutes ago, I told you the patients with private rooms used more pain medicine. Now, by just adding one risk adjustment variable, the table's even. To make you more confused, adding gender and just a select number of 3 or 4 health conditions that they had before they came in the hospital flipped it the entire opposite direction. So Mitch came to this realization that all these papers he was reading, paper after paper, the results could be entirely flipped on their head, depending on what clinical risk adjustment model you use. And you'll see a little bit at noon today, we subsequently went on to map how much of the data that we use in practice all the time actually uses any form of risk adjustment. I'll give you like buzz alert, not that much. That's like terrifying. And so our passion to think, why don't our busiest, robust practices have rigorous researchers right in the middle? It's definitely needed. So when I kind of think like, how did Mitch navigate through this process? For me, when someone who hasn't done healthcare data analytics wants to come into that space, I try to listen pretty closely for their discretionary interest. Mitch was pretty obvious. He said a very specific, I want to measure quality of hospital design, which made that easy. I don't love sending new mentees on rabbit holes and chases. So I try to say, here's data that I have access to, here's methods that I know, and I will teach those to you to apply in a new setting without giving them too many roadblocks to get there, and then showing them how those tools can be transferred. So we will leave our kind of concluding thoughts up here about kind of bringing some designers into healthcare world and healthcare world to designers. And I think we'll just open up for questions and discussion.
So I'm in professional practice. And so I'm curious, we talk a lot about POEs, how it's kind of the missing loop, how do we actually note whether we're meeting our sustainability outcomes, seeing how a detail is actually like existing in the real world. But I don't know, we are finding a block, even just contractually, trying to actually get access back into our buildings. So I don't know. I don't know if y'all have any advice about how to begin to actually be a part of those measures, because we work on schools, and so even just trying to get back into a school facility when you're not affiliated with the district, they're just so I'm curious if you have any advice.
I have a proposal at noon if you want to come back, but I'll defer to Upali first right now.
Oh, good. So then you can refute it. It is difficult. And I think the best way to do it is in partnership. There is also the issue of bias. If you're a firm and you're going in and you're measuring your own project, that's problematic. The way we've often done it is when we do occupancy evaluations, we do a partnership with an academic institution and let the students do it, or work with a nonprofit. So first, the third-party evaluation will help a little bit. I do think practitioners need to go visit their own buildings. I think they are the most vested in learning from it, so that is vital. But the idea that all of us are trying to do our own POEs is so fundamentally flawed that I don't even know where to start, right? Like it's just, I can see so many people nodding heads saying, it feels like for decades we've been having this conversation. Why don't we have standardized tools? Why are we fighting on the tools? Maybe we'll get there. Ellen's in the audience, Anjali's in the audience. Like I can see a lot of people just saying, I don't know. Like, well, I don't know, what is it? I think it is the issue of time and really getting a robust coalition in place where we can just decide we're not going to fight on the tools. Let's just decide on the tools and have the facility, instead of thinking that an architecture firm wants to do this for themselves. The benefit to them has to be really evident. They have to be invested in it and they have to be authors of it with you. That's the only way it works. We have one study. What time are we presenting, Renee? 10:25. So we can talk about how working with the universities themselves, what sometimes we've done with educational clients is take students from that university to do the POE and fund them instead of trying to fund yourself and your team going in and nosing around. That helps. But I will say your bigger problem is lack of standardized tools. We have them for healthcare through the center. We don't have standardized tools for education. Erica Eitland was here. I think she just walked out, but I know there's a movement happening for getting standardized tool for EDU facilities. And this would be something EDRA would be able to help with. Very long-winded answer that I empathize with your problem. You have a silver bullet at 12?
Yeah, I'll give a slight preview of it.
Yeah,
that is to say, from just healthcare as an example, 15 years ago, hospitals were like a one-off hospital. There's kind of these individual hospitals. Now they're these, now they're these conglomerates of 15 hospitals. So I can just think of one recent client who has hospitals on 3 continents, and they have 50 active construction projects right now. The pitch to them to do a POE is so valuable because this project's going to be done in a year, and they know in the next 5 years they have at least 10 more. So all of a sudden, because these health systems have gotten to scale, the POE has like a direct return that was never there like 10 years ago, but now it is. So part of what I'm hopeful to convince you about at noon is that we're going to enter the era of a standardized POE, and that there's actually a business case for it that is much more realistic than it was a decade ago. So fingers crossed.
So I'm at Carnegie Mellon, and we're thinking a lot about health at home and looking at Mayo Clinic, others. And I'm wondering, has anyone thought about POE for health at home models? Because I think the discussion now we're hearing a lot is, I'm bummed to say it, is that the hospital is being faded out as the model or center of care. So I'm curious, is that discussion starting to happen?
I believe so. And I'm looking around the room because I know a few people are working on aging in place and home-based models. So again, I'm sure there are researchers here who are doing it.
We've been trying to think of a web-based application that can enable elderly to redesign or evaluate their homes to support not necessarily aging in place, but for people who are coming out of orthopedic joint replacement surgeries. How can they sort of proactively assess their home to see what changes can happen? So we've done some of the initial research with that. The hope is to create that in a easy to use application format, because right now what happens is these evaluations are done by rehab therapists and so on, who will come into your home and do that work. But people, most elderly or most individuals don't have the expertise to do it. So we have been doing that. I think there are other things out there, but they're not easily available. So we've done a couple of literature reviews on what kind of tools exist. So you might want to take a look at that.
I also think that Andrew made a point, which I want to go back to, that sometimes doing an occupancy evaluation, there's nothing post about occupancy, right? Like you're really measuring it when environments are occupied, but a bigger business case is made when you're doing it as a diagnostic before you invest more. So we sometimes do design diagnostics, which are really occupancy evaluations, but you do them before you invest. Unfortunately, once people have made the investment, depending on what typology it is, their desire to know where they failed or not is very variable. Like corporate clients do not want to know where they failed, because then what are you going to do with the information? If you're not going to take action on that information, a POE can get really tricky. So that's the other component. But health systems are accountable to improved health outcomes. So you have that. And I think for home-based, you'd have the same argument that it doesn't make sense to make an investment without doing an evaluation.
I think the parallel to the POE in the health at home that's getting a lot of traction in the health world is the idea of remote monitoring. And this idea of like, all right, with your smartwatch or whatever, how much can I pick up on? The orthopedics example is really powerful, that if somebody 3 or 4 days in a row after going home is doing X number of steps per day and it falls off, does that automatically trigger some alert evaluation to get that? So I would love if there's a way to bring the clinical outcomes and measurement and monitoring alongside the built environment evaluation. I think that's probably where the really exciting combination exists. I love that question. Thank you.
Hey, so thanks so much for your presentation. I loved it, absolutely. So a lot of the times I think in the way of POE, there's a barrier, and I think that's the client themselves. So I figured sometimes it's hard to justify how beneficial a POE can be to a client, because they think, oh, it's only gonna benefit the architecture firm. It's not of any use to us or anything like that. So I just wanted to know how you would respond to that, or like how you would justify that to a client, especially like in healthcare. We've seen there are more hospitals and more clinics becoming on board with that, but with the other like areas like higher ed or like other place types, we see that's still the case, like justifying POE and how beneficial it can be to the client.
You mentioned that in Canada, it's a requirement for all public projects, I believe. Is there anyone from Canada here? it's just really interesting that we have this discussion, but in some countries, that's just a requirement for public projects that you have to show that you did what you set out to do with public money. And we don't have that here. I think the argument, like I said, for the client is the client has to see themselves as a partner in it. One thing we found is often when you do an occupancy evaluation, you identify a lot of operational issues. You don't identify facility issues only. And being able to show that really it's a robust, integrated evaluation that talks about how the built environment is being used can help. It's very important you have the conversation in terms of co-benefits rather than benefit to the architecture firm that I want to see how my design did. Well, that's not benefiting everyone. What you want to do is we want to know how the design is functioning against what you intended and how you can improve it so that you really get the outcomes that you set out to achieve from the beginning.
Yeah, I think one great benefit from the sustainability movement and AIA endorsing it has been a focus on some really clean objective measures. So the idea of energy efficiency at 1 year after a building's opened, that has so much buy-in because there's such a clear financial dollar. And even if we just normalized that as every project we do, we're going to do that, and then start to chip away at like, well, what's the second most interesting thing to you as a client, and start there to at least establish a normative process. Also part of the noon talk today, not to arm twist anyone, but that's also part of noon.
You guys just have to go out and like spread the word about the noon talk. Like that's the mission. But HCAP scores is another one. So one of the things I would say, if there are anybody in health, oh, we have Andrew. One of the issues that we have is the standardized metrics don't ask questions about the built environment. So HCAPS has a quietness at night and cleanliness question. So they don't ask even things like incidents like falls. There is nothing really being asked about the built environment. So the other way of getting to it is how do we get built environment questions into the standards metrics that the hospital uses? So there's more data for us to use than us trying to go and ask these original, often non-validated questions. So that's our plug to you, Andrew.
Great, no pressure, thank you.
Other questions? And it can be for anyone in the panel, for Kim, Hannah, Maya, we can take questions for the whole group.
Hi, congrats on your presentation. I'm Eleanor from Brazil, and we are using now more mock-ups. I read some about it you wrote. And do you think even doing mock-ups before and then after 1 year following Fraser's guidelines, should we do POE also?
So when you're doing a diagnostic in the beginning, that's analyzing or understanding what the issue is that you're solving for. A mock-up is the prototyping and testing component. So you have to do that because you're testing and you're prototyping and you're taking that design and it's almost like a simulation, right? But it's a physical simulation. And all of those are still hypotheses until it's built and it's operated and you have real people living real lives in it. So 100%, and mock-ups should be refining your design intent and your hypothesis. And you should say, okay, this is how the mock-up performed. How did it perform in real life operations? And that I think is really a great point, that you do want to do the simulation in the middle. During the design process, which is iterative, you have to constantly test out your solutions. And then you have to go and test out the final model. It would be wonderful if system clients thought about every project as a lab for the next project, because that's what they are. But the fact that we don't connect points, like how many, even in a single firm, I'm always amazed at how many people are working on a patient room at any single point in time and not talking to each other. Right? I think, right? It's just, we don't know how to pool our resources together. So we are not thinking all the time about stuff we don't need to think about. So if clients did that, if each hospital, there are some really interesting examples, like in Taiwan, there's a hospital that has identified one floor as a mock-up floor. Anything that they build, they will mock it up, try it, and then implement it. So I think hospitals are getting into it. We're seeing a lot of great examples from Asia doing this right now.
I think we have exactly 1 minute left, so I'll use that time to thank Kim Rawlings. She's been our organizer of this session, who wrangled us all together, created the framework, and made sure we had our slides in on time. So thank you, Kim, for your vision for this and pulling us all together. And thanks to everyone for coming at 8 a.m. How wonderful. All right, we'll see you at noon.